So I guess we are starting. Um, First of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody out there. Wow, there are lots of attendees, and there are probably a ton of people on YouTube. And I'm really glad I can't see that number because then I don't have to be nervous. So my name is Jacques Laroche. I'm a computer scientist trying to make sense of the world and fighting for social justice and just trying to make things better, in whatever way that I can on this journey. And so basically, I want to say thank you to the lab for giving us this space and this platform. And the lab is a vehicle for reflection and change via artistic experimentation. They strive to give a voice to the underrepresented in the form of space and funding. So that's what we've got here. And you should, if you haven't, take a look at thelab.org. But with all of that said, they are not holding this, this is not, they give this space to others so that there can be new voices, and they're not, moderating or anything like that. They try very hard to have organic kind of conversations come out that are created by the people who are doing the discussions. So I wanted to put that out there. And 2 points of consideration. After this, you'll probably get something in your email so that you can fill out a survey, and the survey will give you an opportunity to weigh in on what is going to come next and what you thought worked and all sorts of other stuff. So just check that in the mail. And I think that is about, oh yeah, also the other point of consideration is we want to have very diverse voices on this. So if you have not yet, please call up your friends, send them the invite, and have them come on as soon as you can, as soon as they can, so we can have their voices heard as well. So with that out of the way, the title for tonight's talk is The Case for Economic Disobedience. And our guide tonight is Astra Taylor. Rather than listing out accolades, which there are many, I want to approach this introduction in a slightly different way. So in a time of crisis, we're in a time of crisis. We kind of been in a time of crisis for quite a while, right? This is just a different crisis. So let's be real about that. But the thing about this is it's an unfolding all over the place, right? We've got crisis in the US, in Asia, Europe, Africa, Caribbean, all over, and there's a underlying common denominator about this. And there's some specific things that come out of this crisis, like inability to see others and things like this. So for this new round of crisis, we're challenged. And what we need for challenges during times of that challenge us is to be able to reflect and think differently and boldly demand, right? And to do this, we're required, kind of like the lab says this, we want to reconsider our knowledge across different social and professional fields. We also want to ask questions. We want to, for example, what are we living for? How can we reimagine our relationships? And the most important, what do we do now? Right? So with all that said, what better person to guide us through this than Astra Taylor? Astra is, what I like to say, a complete human being, right? A relentless questioner who looks at the world from multiple unique angles, a relentless doer who acts in the world without fear, guided by conscience and accumulated wisdom. This is a person who writes, creates music, makes films exploring life, democracy, and even the quixotic Slavoj Žižek. So this is definitely the person who has the strength to also call debt what it is, onerous, illegitimate, and to be resisted. So with all that said, that's probably a good segue for tonight's talk, which is the case for economic disobedience. Also, just a few other points for everybody attending in the attendee section of Zoom or whatnot. So you want to, I'm going to put on my IT hat here. There's going to be a bar at the bottom, right, that says mute and also chat, Q&A, things like this. You want to, and raise hand, right? So you want to try to use those functions. Raise hand if there's something that you want to say. Use the Q&A. We're gonna take all of the stuff that's in there, and that's going to generate all of the discussion that's going to happen after this talk. We're going to have 30 minutes for that second part. With all of that said, I'm going to pass it over to dear Astra.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? It's good. Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction for my comrade Jacques, who I invited to be in conversation with me here. We are longtime organizing buddies, going back to the days of Occupy Wall Street, which I will talk about a bit. And he's also one of the stars of my film, What is Democracy? So if you want to see more of him, that's one reason to check out the movie, which is streaming. And thank you to Dina for inviting us to have this space. Dina's connected to my sister, Sonora Taylor. And so it feels like a nice kind of reunion for us all to be here. It's cool. Okay, so the case for economic disobedience. I think Jacques and I will have failed if we do not convince some of you that this is an appropriate terminology and that we have some unique strategies to offer. I mean, Jacques and I hang out virtually all day long on our organizing channels, trying to figure out how to build power for debtors. And that has become even more urgent in this crisis, the crisis that Jacques just laid out, right? The crisis, the sort of iteration of this ongoing crisis. You know, and I'm very into etymology, if you know me. So one thing I've been saying lately is that the origins, the etymology of that word, the word, and it's a word that does get tossed around a lot. It's sort of abused. Crisis comes from the ancient Greek, and it means a turning point in an illness, you know, turning towards death or recovery. And so that word it felt very overused, and now it feels apt, you know, like which way are we going? I think it's important to I want to begin, because this is the space we're in. We're in the COVID-19 moment. That's why we're talking by Zoom. And to just sort of lay out a few points, at least, that frame my understanding of this moment. And one is that, you know, I think that this pandemic has really revealed that the crisis is capitalism, because so much of what we're experiencing doesn't have to do with this novel pathogen itself, you know, which is obviously a problem. It's a disease that we have no immunity to, but you know, it's a disease that actually emerged, that evolved in part because of our land use practices, because farmers have been forced, just like so many other zoonotic pathogens, have been forced to sort of encroach further on wildlife, and we've reduced the biodiversity of forests, and so these illnesses that jump the species barriers from non-human animals to human beings are increasing in number. I mean, almost every major disease that we're afraid of, whether it's Ebola, HIV, swine flu, avian flu, follow this sort of pattern, right? Like so this is not just strictly a natural disaster, where it's actually a political disaster itself, the disease itself. But it's also revealing the weakness of our healthcare system, the fact that there's no safety net, the fact that our economy is structured so that the already rich and powerful can seize this opportunity to further enrich themselves. And so I think this, you know, we have to really have this frame that it's a political disaster more than a natural one. So what is happening? I mean, it almost boggles the mind to think about how many people have become unemployed in the United States alone in the last few weeks, and what that means. I mean, we at the Debt Collective have been very focused on people's economic precarity, the fact that the vast majority of people have less than nothing to begin with. They don't have wealth, they have debt. The average American before the crisis died with $62,000 of debt. The average student borrower graduates from college with $35,000 of debt. Now they're going to be graduating with that for Zoom classes. You know, consumer debt, things like credit card debt, have been used for basic needs, for things like keeping a roof over your head, for feeding your family, not for these luxury items that we always hear about. And so one of the principles that we operate on is that people are in debt not because they live beyond their means, but because they are denied the means to live. So I think debtor organizing is all the more pertinent at this moment when millions and millions and millions of people are not able to pay their bills, right? I mean, we have seen headlines that, something like 30%. I mean, when you look a little deeper, it got murkier, but a huge number of people compared to a month or 2 months ago were not able to pay their rent at the first of this month. When people have to choose between paying a credit card bill or giving money to a debt collector, they prioritize food, they prioritize needs. So what we're saying is, in a moment of crisis like this, when huge numbers of people are not going to be able to pay and debt is going to explode and people are going to spiral into default, this is an opening to reframe the way we understand debt and credit relations and the way we understand our economy. And it's an opportunity actually to build power. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. We're also seeing, in this moment, all of these terms, every time I talk about this, I struggle with the terminology because, some people call it a stimulus package, but the economy didn't need to be stimulated, right? People need help surviving. What we needed was a survival package. Again, the economy didn't need to be saved. People need to be saved. It's a relief package, but relief for who? I mean, there's just a revelation today that, the federal government did say, okay, we're not going to garnish people's $1,200 stimulus checks for, tax returns or because, or for, state taxes, either so federal or state. It turns out that actually banks have the green light to take people's checks if they're deposited into accounts that are in arrears, or if they owe money, if they're behind on their loans to these banks. So, who gets bailed out? I mean, it's sort of the same. It just conjures that 2011 Occupy Wall Street chant, right? The banks got bailed out, we got sold out. This time, it wasn't strictly the banks. It wasn't the banks who caused the crisis, and that this was an exogenous event, right? The coronavirus destabilizing the economy because people are sheltering in place, and that's decimated the service sector, et cetera. But it's the financial sector, it's the corporate sector that is positioned, that has enough power to exploit the crisis. And so I think that that's, an important context. So let's go back to 2008, because 2008 is what caused, Jacques and I to meet at Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was this very delayed response to the 2008 crisis. But essentially, the problems in the financial sector that caused the mortgage meltdown, weren't really addressed. We didn't see the banks become more disciplined since then. We haven't seen the corporate sector become more disciplined. We've seen the same old story of corporations trying to weaken the bargaining power of workers, of further financializing, pushing money out to their shareholders, and basically being rewarded for that. So interest rates have been very low. I mean, extremely, extremely low since 2008. And so then the corporate sector took on actually all of this corporate debt. So that's a major factor in the economy's weak position right now. And I say this to just highlight a kind of double standard around indebtedness that is a recurring theme, which is that, the rich and powerful can walk away from their debts all the time. They can over leverage themselves and get help at the taxpayer's expense. They can get public money to sort of help them out, or they have access to bankruptcy provisions that regular people don't have. Whereas, little people are held to very punitive economic standards, right? And it's like, well, if you haven't balanced your personal budget, then it's your fault and you're going to be punished for it. And and that punishment in the United States can lead to literally being incarcerated. Advocates have been talking for the last few years about the return of debtors' prisons. I mean, 4 or 5 months ago, like everyone, time is sort of blurring, but about 4 or 5 months ago, I got a call from people working in a hospital, actually Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, some folks associated with the nurses union, and they were basically concerned because their patients who couldn't pay their emergency room bills were going to jail over these medical debts and then losing their homes, right? So just owing a few hundred or a few $1,000s from going to the hospital was completely destroying people's lives. So that leads one to wonder, wow, what's going to happen to all of these unfortunate souls who are treated for COVID-19 and come out with these bills that are looking already to be $30, $40, $50, $60, $70,000. What's going to happen to people who can't pay them? So 2008, I think set the stage in many, many ways for where we are. But the story of debt, because we're in a kind of more multidisciplinary context, the story of debt goes back much further. I mean, debt and debtor politics and debt revolt precedes capitalism. And this is something that I explore in the film I mentioned, What is Democracy? And the book, it's sort of companion book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, that came out last year. And debt precedes capitalism. It's a very sort of straightforward, brutal economic relationship. So if you go back to ancient Greece, the sort of birth moment of democracy was actually this debtors revolt, because what was happening is that these farmers were falling into debt and then selling themselves into slavery. And so there was a revolt, and this created this sort of moment of opportunity where a kind of enlightened aristocrat started to institute reforms that led to the Greek democracy. We also had, there's a debtors revolt that led to the famous tribune of the people, of the plebs in ancient Rome. So debt revolts are truly ancient history. So we're part of this ancient tradition, what we're trying to cook up at the Debt Collective. And you see it going back to this founding of the United States. You see it in a figure, you see it in the dueling figures of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. James Madison and the rest of the founding fathers wrote what you could call a creditor's constitution. They were very wary of debtors, right? James Madison called debt abolition a wicked project. It was one of the things he named as just, beyond the pale. And yet they were aware of debt's powers. Thomas Jefferson, for example, when he was thinking about sort of his kind, white men who he thought deserved dignified lives, he thought, okay, debts should actually expire. They shouldn't weigh people down eternally. But yet, I quote a letter that he wrote to a fellow political leader saying, what we should use? We should use debt to dispossess indigenous people of their territory. When they won't sell their land to us, when they won't give their land to us, which of course we should have it, we should drive them into debt at the trading houses, and then we'll be able to take it. So let's use debt as a tool of domination and dispossession. So this is a recurring motif. And we see this at the sort of personal level, dispossessing individuals, and also at the national level. We see the way that Haiti, which had the first true multiracial democratic revolt, was punished. The entire country was punished with a massive debt to France, and essentially saying, pay us back forever. And so debt always has a politics to it. And that continues to this day. And so, how do we describe the sort of phase of capitalism we're in typically? It's often called, financialization, neoliberalism. Some optimistic people call it late capitalism. I don't know. But financialization, I think one really simple way of thinking about it is financialization for most of us is experienced as the age of debt. Like that's what it means on the ground. On the ground, it means to be indebted. And that's because what are the sort of trademarks of financialization? Well, one, is the attack on labor unions and the suppression of wages, and therefore people, so we've had stagnating wages through my entire life, right? Wages have stagnated, and that has been masked by sort of democratized access to credit. So people have compensated for those stagnating wages and the lack of benefits by borrowing. And that's part of why there's this explosion of personal debt. Financialization is also about sort of wrapping every asset in debt. So we see the way higher education has been financialized. There's been divestment, disinvestment at the state level. Tuition has filled the gap. And what tuition means is students taking out loans, borrowing in order to access education. And then they are indebted for that education. It looks like, housing, right? It looks like the American dream of the house that you own and the white picket fence, but that ownership being via mortgages, lending, and of course, lending on predatory terms, who was redlined, who was offered higher interest rates. And so sociologists talk about predatory inclusion, the fact that access to credit has not been given equally or in a democratic fashion, right? Some are able to use credit, that access to credit is what built the white middle class, but access to credit on predatory terms and exploitative unjust terms is part of what buries another set of people, right? And digs them into a hole that, it's just mathematically impossible to get out of. So financialization is experienced as the age of debt. So I think that, we often frame things as we move from a welfare state to a debt-fair state, right? So now we finance via debt basic social services. And that points to what we think the solution is. I mean, you can think of debt in multiple ways. One is to think of it as wage theft. This is debt at the individual level, right? So wages have stagnated, and then, so you're underpaid and then you borrow, so you're stolen from twice, right? Your life is stolen from you on the job, and then you have to borrow money and pay interest, so you're robbed twice. So it's wage theft, but it's also because of the lack of access to public goods. If there was social housing, then we wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have the same relationship to homes as a speculative asset, right? And we could live in a house and enjoy its use value and not worry about its exchange value. If we had free universal higher education, there wouldn't be student loans. If we had universal healthcare, like so many other industrial democracies, then there's no medical debt. There's no medical debt in the country I was born in Canada. So that's the condition, that's the struggle we're in. Making it even more difficult is the fact that we're not just in the red, right? We're not just in the red, but we're in the dark. We don't know as individuals, we often don't know who we even owe money to. This is part of the challenge of organizing around debt, is people often don't know that their debts are bought and sold and traded like commodities. It was the bundling of mortgages, right? And then selling those bundled mortgages, selling futures, but ultimately those were people's debts that became disconnected from them is, what precipitated the mortgage crisis in 2008. But, just on a more simple everyday level, if a debt collector calls you and says, hey, you owe me $1,000 for that ride in the ambulance, that debt collector isn't connected to anyone who picked you up when you were in your moment of need, right? They're a vulture who bought your debt for pennies on the dollar and is trying to get something from you to make a profit. And so the chains of debt are often sort of interrupted and opaque. And so one part of our mission is to provide clarity so that then we can figure out where debtors actually have leverage. And leverage is what we're all about. The idea is that our debts are always somebody else's assets, right? And that goes for the debt collector hounding you, right? That they own a property, they own a portfolio of debts, and that's an asset. They're trying to make more money collecting than they paid for that debt. When you owe money to an entity, it's on the books as an asset. So it's always, so on the one hand, it's this sort of negative balance for the debtor, but it's an asset for the creditor. And so our thinking is, well, the $1.7 trillion of student debt that exists today is $1.7 trillion of leverage if we can get organized to wield it. And we take inspiration from the old adage of Paul Getty that says, if you owe the bank $100,000, the bank owns you. But if you owe the bank $100 million, then you own the bank. So if there's enough of us working in concert, then the calculus changes. And this is a theory we've put into practice. So I just want to quickly recap. So I think part of why debt interests me is I think it's politically strategic. And we'll give you some examples of why, but it's also philosophically quite interesting, right? So debt is a form of domination. That's one thing. I mean, I think I'm sort of blanking on it now, but somebody influential said that a nation of homeowners will not rebel. Now, who was it? It was the economist. I'm blanking on his names, but but this idea that debt is a form of domination. I mean, we see that in myriad ways through time. I mean, we see that with sharecroppers, right? So we see the way that after the Civil War, slavery was ended, and yet people were driven into debt and turned into sharecroppers as a sort of another form of free labor, but economic domination. Debt is very ideological. There's this sense that, if you're in debt, it's because it's your fault. You made a mistake. Instead of looking at how it's a structural condition, again, if you have medical debt, it's because you're living in a society that doesn't provide healthcare as a human right and as a public good. And if you're underpaid and there's no way that you can live off of the minimum wage, let alone live with dignity, then you're probably in debt to a payday lender because you have no other choice. But there's a huge amount of shame around indebtedness. And that's an important thing as organizers for us to work to overcome, to sort of switch the lens and to say, no, you're actually, it's not just your fault. And so we stay away from the language of forgiveness for that reason, because we don't believe debtors need to be forgiven for the fact that they tried to get an education or the fact that they got cancer and had the nerve to seek treatment, right? We think those debts are odious and immoral and shouldn't exist. Debt is anti-democratic. I gave the example of Haiti already. You can look at the way that debt has functioned, sovereign debt has functioned as a form of control of entire populations, right? Going back to the 70s, sovereign debt often came with these onerous terms and conditions that were part of structural adjustment policies. And it was sort of the same thing of the myth of the bad individual debtor, but scaled up to the country level, right? That erased the history of colonialism and exploitation and imposed the discipline of debt on countries. And lastly, I think, one thing about debt is that it's ecologically, there's a sort of temporal dimension that's very interesting. It's ecologically destructive. So debt is predicated on the idea that there will be more tomorrow than there is today. That's what it means to pay back something with interest. And so debt, as we have it today, is locked in this logic of endless growth, right? It compels us. We sign contracts today that compel us to seek growth tomorrow. So there's this way in which it constrains the future. I have to mortgage my future to access the money I need today, whether it's money to go to school or money to pay for a hospital bill or to pay for my house. But then it also, on a social level, locks us into this growth model. And so in that sense, it's very ecologically problematic when we know the climate crisis that is brewing. So personally, so these are sort of part of why I'm interested in thinking about our economy through this lens. I mean, and I do want to say that I don't think all debt is bad, right? I think this credit on productive terms, socially productive credit, could expand our futures. Right? That's the idea, is that credit ultimately means trust. That's what the term means in its origin. And you can extend credit so that we can build the things we need today: green infrastructure, beautiful schools, parks, right? So it's not that we're just purely anti-debt. I mean, I think I think within the system of capitalism, debt is typically a predatory force, but I think imagining what socially productive credit would be and what generative economic relationships would be is something that's really essential too. So I came to this work, I mean, on a personal level, I defaulted on my student loans in 2008 when I was making my film Examine Life. The mortgage crisis affected my family. My parents ended up losing their house. And I remember the first day, but I always just wanted an economic justice movement. I mean, I wanted a movement that was socialist in its politics, and Occupy Wall Street was what there was in 2011. And the left was late. I mean, you have to remember the Tea Party emerged as a response to the mortgage crisis in 2009. So the right was ahead of us. And Occupy Wall Street came to be the fall of 2011 as part of this global wave of pro-democracy movements, right? That was the sort of word, the word democracy, that united all these movements from the Arab Spring to the movement of the squares. And in Zuccotti Park, I think it was the third or fourth day, there was this person shouting, "Step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. And they had a big piece of paper. And all these people were writing these numbers that were quite astounding: $120,000 in student loans, $300,000 in an underwater mortgage, $60,000 of medical bills. And, I wrote my figure. And what it was this, the first moment I had experienced of a politicization of this personal economic condition. And it was very clear that debt is what brought people to these encampments across the country, right? That we were mad the banks got bailed out, we got sold out, but we experienced that being sold out as being indebted and just not being able to see a path forward. And so, sorry, my dog is going crazy. My dog really likes this pandemic lifestyle too. We're like always home. So, but the idea, Jacques and I came together and others, and we formed an initiative that first our goal was always to do debtor organizing, right? We saw debtor organizing as something that was complementary to labor organizing, that essentially working people were leaving power on the table, and that we can't afford to do that. And that debtor organizing would be something that would be complementary to traditional labor organizing, to racial justice organizing, to environmental organizing, but that it was, still sort of nascent, that it needed to it was a concept that we needed to manifest. And so our first experiment was something called the Rolling Jubilee. And so what we did was we essentially acted as debt collectors, but for good. So we bought portfolios of debt on the secondary debt market. But then instead of collecting on it as debt collectors do, we erased it all. And we ended up sending out letters. I mean, we sent one Christmas themed version where we sent letters to just strangers across the country saying your debt has been erased with no strings attached, as a gift from Occupy Wall Street. And the point of doing that was to sort of change the way people understand debt, to drive home this idea that your debt is being sold and traded, and that somebody is profiting from the fact that you're suffering. But the idea was always to build power. And so out of that experiment and the group that coalesced around it, we created the Debt Collective. And the Debt Collective is essentially a union for debtors. And the idea is that people need to get organized to exercise collective power. And we launched the first ever student debt strike in 2015, organizing. It began with 15 student debtors who went to a predatory for-profit college, and they committed an act of economic disobedience. They basically said, we're not paying these illegitimate loans. They had gone to a particularly predatory college chain that targeted first-generation students, single mothers, Black women in particular, and basically gave them nothing and charged them enormous sums and sort of left them in a worse state than they were before they attended college. And these are businesses that are hugely propped up by the federal government and by the Department of Education, and in fact have special carve-outs in the new stimulus package, where even if they lose students, they'll keep getting federal money. So these are very predatory institutions. And in a nutshell, over developing a legal strategy and relentless organizing with people from all over the country and different schools, we have over 1.5 billion with a B dollars of debt relief for tens of thousands of people, and eventually partnered with, in different ways, with the Warren and Sanders campaign on their student debt cancellation proposals and free college proposals. And in fact, we came up with a legal strategy that Elizabeth Warren, at least, and I hope Sanders would have used it too, a legal strategy that would allow the Secretary of Education with one signature to erase all federal student debt. So 95% of student debt. So about 95% of that 1.7 trillion without having to go through Mitch McConnell. So the idea is that, this is sort of what our our scrappy group has done, right? Taking this idea that debtors have power if they could act in concert, and managed to put, when you add it all up, over $2 billion back in debtors' pockets. And at this moment, I think this is a moment when this idea needs to take hold, because, as I said, we're just at the beginning of the economic disaster that's unfolding, and an unbelievable number of people are not going to be able to meet their basic needs. And debt, unfortunately, is going to explode. And there is a kind of consciousness, I think, that's manifesting, where I think you see people saying, well, hold on, there needs to be moratoriums on debt collection, on evictions, right? And we need to build on that and push not just for a pause, a sort of temporary reprieve, but also for serious cancellation, because it is possible. I mean, that's one thing our work demonstrates, is that $1.5 billion of student loans can be erased, right? What we're also seeing right now, there is actually a pause on student loan repayments thanks to the coronavirus. So what we're seeing is the government doesn't need those payments. They're simply, the government doesn't need to collect people's student loans to function. And so this is a form of debt that, simply, I think, torments people without serving a bigger social purpose, let alone a sort of financial purpose. So, I think social movements, there's an article that came out yesterday in the New York Times by my friend Astra Taylor. And, I think we're all thinking a lot about what it means to revolt in an age of social distancing and how hard that is. And it poses a lot of challenges. I mean, on the one hand, we're seeing frontline workers striking in really powerful ways because they don't have the privilege of social distancing. But she makes the point that, every social movement has to adapt to its challenging conditions. The conditions are never easy, and they always require creativity. And I think in this moment, one challenge of debtor politics has been that debtors aren't in the same space, right? So workers, laborers share a factory floor. They meet at the workplace, but we don't all meet at the Bank of America or at the payday lender every day so we can get to know each other and see each other and recognize our commonality. So debtor, we've always had to mobilize in a different way than labor organizing, right? Where we do outreach, we find each other through other means. We found some of our members, for example, through the Rolling Jubilee, we erased their debts and then they became part of the union. So we've always had this challenge of organizing at a distance. And I think so in a way, I think debtor organizing is uniquely poised to meet this moment, right? Because these connections, these chains of financial obligations and these relationships we have with these, rather opaque mechanisms, they persist in this time, and they're forms of leverage that we have that we don't have to necessarily be in the same space to wield. So before we go to the audience, Jacques, I'd really love you to just talk a little bit about how you came to this organizing, because you've been involved in it as long as I have in different ways, and what you saw as the appeal.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I'm a little bit scattered because I'm answering people's questions.
Okay, yeah, I'm just ignoring that.
No, definitely. Okay, so I mean, look, and it's a story. It's kind of like, I feel we all in some way can relate to the sort of tacit story of needing to get education to better yourself, right? Growing up in the United States, it's just it's a cloud that's like there. It's just the air that we breathe, right? And the story is that, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s were like kind of like my heyday. So basically a lot of statistics were coming out then and saying, look, you can't make it with a high school diploma. But it's not just like can't make it. You're going to be the underclass, the thing that you don't want to be, right? It's this looming dark cloud. Like you're going to be, poor and destitute, and it's all bad. So you gotta go to school, right? No matter the cost. And it's a story. It's a fairy tale story, right? So if you're young and you're, let's say, you're 18 years old, 19 years old, and then you're getting into college, and what happens, a stack of papers are thrown in front of you. This is what you sign so you can get in. And at that age, you don't even really understand what in God's name that really means. It's really just like, this is the key to have a future, right? So in that sense, it's really, it's a fraud, right? It's a false choice. Like who without the means is not gonna take that key or make that decision. And that's where, for me, that's what it was. I did that, and I did it, for grad school as well. And it's just too much. It's not, you can't live. You have this gigantic shackle on you and you can't survive. So from there, just growing up Black in America, it's just kind of like the oppression, the kind of the injustice, the everything, and being able to start to identify, oh, wait, this also is a giant oppressive, machine of injustice. Like, oh, how do other people not see this? So that's kind of, that was the entry point. I got my first job coming out of college in New York, and I think it was like $25,000 a year living. Anybody who's lived in New York, that's really, really tough. That's an understatement. That's being tough, right? And then at the same time, I was paying these student loans that were, I think they were like $600-700 a month. It's just completely absurd, right? So you're forced into the situation where you're just kind of like, this doesn't make sense. And getting connected with Strike Debt, which was, putting the inequity and the kind of the whole Ponzi scheme of debt right out in the open for analysis and understanding, and for something that you can fight against was a godsend. So that's really how I got into this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, it's just basically the whole, you've really called out a lot of the aspects of what we should be learning from this moment, right? I will reiterate that a lot of the things that we can learn from COVID is that the governments around the world can really do a lot more than they say or pretend that they can and can't do in quote unquote normal times, right? Even in these quote unquote normal times, there were lots of examples calling their bullshit, right? So basically, whenever war was declared, just unlimited gobs of money would get funneled into making weapons, like sending, gigantic machinery of death all over to the globe, right? At the same time, you're like, can we get a little bit more money for, fill in the blank social program here? And there's absolutely zero available, yet there's, thousands of times more available for the things that they deem to be important. And all we're seeing now is an intensification of all of that, right? We're seeing the ability for them to send direct cash payments, as little as that penance may be. Like, it's possible for them to do that, right? We're seeing that. We're also seeing what their priorities are, which, again, it happens all the time, but we're seeing it intensify now. So if the U.S. government can bail out cruise lines and call cruise lines, an industry that is indispensable, yet they can't pay for healthcare during a pandemic. They can't even bring up the fact that these things should be, it's like, oh, well, this thing can kill you, and if you get it, then you're just gonna have to pay. But the cruise lines, you definitely have to be able to go to the Bahamas, and that's really important. So once you add up all of these things, you understand that we're up against an entity that does not care about us in any way, shape, or form. And it's not, I'm not saying that to be depressed or to be, to like shut yourself up in isolation even more. It's to say like, God damn it, absolutely not. We deserve more than this. And we're not just gonna ask for it. We're gonna do what Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without demand. We must demand, and you can't demand off of nothing, right? It can't be based off of the goodwill or like the nice fluffy feelings or like you being in the right. We have to demand based off of leverage and the ability to force, our adversary to be able to give us what we need, what we should have, right? We're not asking for more than we should. We're not taking anything that isn't deserved. So I don't know. All of those things are yeah.
No, I think that's so right. I mean, it's basically power concedes nothing without a demand backed up by power. And so, that's why we always come back to the idea of leverage. I mean, it's interesting thinking back to 2011, because the big debt discussion there was the debt ceiling, right? And the government shutdown. And, when we were very much at the time thinking about the way the right successfully mobilizes, fear of deficits to cut public services, right? And so they have this very simplistic framework that is misleading, but that the public sort of believes because it applies to our sort of personal households where it's like, well, the government doesn't have enough money, therefore it has to cut things. And of course, it always cuts healthcare, it always cuts social services, it doesn't cut the military budget, which always grows. What's interesting, I guess, about this moment is that those concerns just seem to be totally blasted out the window, right? They're just like, here's $2 trillion. And by the way, it can be leveraged into 6 trillion. And this question of like, how are you going to pay for it is now out the window. And I suppose one thing I really hope is that, the Democrats stop this obsession with the pay for it question as a result of this. I mean, this was something even Bernie Sanders, who, we were very happy to present our, to have debt strikers speak when he announced the College for All bill. This happened last summer with Representative Ilhan Omar, who really actually is the one who pushed the idea of full student debt cancellation in Washington, and AOC was there, and Representative Jayapal from Washington. But the College for All bill, which would have erased all student debt and funded public college, was tied to, it was sort of like, we will cancel all student debt and raise it and sort of pay for it with a tax on Wall Street. And this idea that everything has to find its corresponding sum of money. And on something, I mean, in many instances, it's just ridiculous, because if you engage in public spending that actually enriches the society. If you have a healthier population, then the society is going to pay for itself in a different kind of way. And I think, the argument for canceling all student debt very much fits into that. I mean, the government, as we're seeing, it doesn't need the revenue of people's student loan payments, but there's a lot of economic research that says if you cancel all student debt, it would actually be an economic boost, because it would actually be a true economic stimulus, because student debtors are the kinds of people, they're not rich, or they wouldn't have student debt. So they're not going to hoard their cash, or maybe buy one extra yacht because they already have one, but otherwise, what can they really consume? I mean, people are going to buy food and pay for their daily lives. And so the estimate is that erasing student debt would provide something like $110 billion a year for 10 years, so over $1 trillion into the economy. So it's like, you don't need to have a corresponding pay for. I think the other thing you said, which is just, normal, it was a crisis before. I mean, for every individual person, every single, foreclosure, every single bankruptcy caused by medical debt is a crisis. I mean, we're already living in a crisis. And this is, what's devastating about this moment, I think, is that we're not more organized. So the debt collective, I mean, one thing I should say about the debt collective is we've been animated by this counterfactual, which is what would have happened in 2008, 2009 if mortgage holders had been organized. So the mortgage crisis was caused by the sort of widespread failure within the system that was ultimately caused by the bankers, who were buying and selling these toxic assets, and then the insurance rating companies that were giving them the AAA seal of approval. But ultimately, a lot of mortgage holders couldn't pay. And so, what if that had been coordinated? Because also then they could have gone to the Obama-Biden administration and said, no, you have to actually give that relief that you promised. The Home Affordability Modification Program, which the HAMP program, which was supposed to reduce people's principals, help mortgage holders. It was supposed to help 4 million families, and only something like under 1 million people got relief from this, right? So what if mortgage holders had been organized in 2008? And that's something that's always motivated us. And, but here we are in a crisis and debtors still aren't organized. So I think, for me, the question is, it's always about power. It's always about leverage. And how are we able to act in concert and strategically to wield the power of numbers that we actually possess? Should I look at these questions?
They're
long.
Yeah, they are. I'm in the middle of. I'll call out a few of them.
Yeah.
Some of the ones that are jumping out at me. I'm not sure if we're at that time yet, but it feels like a good moment. So I just got a really nice question from Matt. Hi, thank you for the great talk. What are the next steps anyone interested in getting more involved with the Debt Collective could take? Okay. Is there a particular place to go, learn more, XYZ? So that's
yes. So we have multiple campaigns happening. So one, I would recommend people go to the debtcollective.org website, which is sort of it's the portal into our online platform, which we call it our virtual factory floor. And it has multiple parts. So one, it has a suite of debt dispute tools. So any debt you have in collections, you can dispute errors on your credit report. You can dispute, if you happen to be someone whose Social Security or taxes are being garnished, you can dispute those. But our sort of focus right now is actually an expanded student debt strike. And but our definition of a debt striker, we're not advocating for willy-nilly financial suicide. I mean, I defaulted on my student loan, so I speak from experience. I mean, basically one day I got a call from my loan servicer and they said, okay, you owe us an extra $15,000 or $20,000. It was something that was just so much that I was like, I can't pay, and now I owe 20% more. And then I was like, I will fight you forever. But if you are in forbearance, deferral, if you're on $0 income-based repayments, we count you as a striker, right? So what we're trying to do is politicize the inability to pay. Over 1 million people a year pre-COVID-19 defaulted, individually defaulting, ashamed, alone, as I did. What if instead of doing it alone, we do it together and we come out as a political force and saying this is a strike, right? This is an act of economic disobedience. We shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we can't pay. I mean, just as Jacques said, if you're making $25,000 a year and your student loan payment $600, it's untenable. And also, education is a public good that shouldn't be treated as a commodity or an investment. So if you can, I would recommend joining the debt strike. And then we're digging into local organizing in mostly in Pennsylvania right now, but trying to pilot some projects that we hope are replicable around just creating no collection sort of zones and lifting up these calls right now for an end to debt collection and foreclosures and evictions and stuff like that, to basically say there has to be a pause on the collection of debt in this crisis, but a pause that ultimately leads to cancellation. One thing I also want to see avoided is, what meager help people do get. For example, just like we're seeing with the stimulus check, sort of the meager relief people get just being taken by creditors who aren't being forced to take any kind of haircut.
Okay, so I've got another one. I answered it, but I think it's a good question that should be brought up. Can the panelists speak more about what the first steps would look like for organizing a large-scale debt strike? Should the focus be on the specific lender? Should there be a counter proposal that comes with the strike, a la Astra's socially useful debt, XYZ?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what we're doing with the student debt strike. It's it's national. Debt is financial matters are always really complicated, and they, it's a sort of decentralized system, and it, the conditions and the sort of targets vary in terms of like whether you're talking about, payday lending, which is regulated more at the state level, or, if you're talking about student loans, as we are in this campaign, then, it really makes sense to have have the Department of Education be the target, because they have the power, and 95% of student loans are federally secured, and that's where the center of this system is. So I think that what we've done is we've laid out our demands, which is for full student debt cancellation. We've also laid out how, again, we developed this sort of legal theory that has become very legitimized, basically that this is an extremely achievable thing. We literally wrote the form that all the Secretary of Education has to do is sign it, write their name, and poof, student debt will disappear. And then there's different levels of onboarding. So you can declare yourself on strike. Again, if you're in one of these states of non-payment, you can threaten to strike in the future if you're not ready to commit to this phase, or you can be in solidarity. And the solidarity blocks at this point, I think they could take various forms, but they seem to be right now are sort of two categories of people. One is professors, teachers who are very concerned about their students and who feel quite agonized at the fact that the students they teach are mortgaging their futures, and also teenagers who are very politicized in this moment, obviously with the climate movement and the movement against gun violence, and who see a highly indebted future for themselves and are worried about it, and want to make their opinion known, and their opinion is that student debt shouldn't exist. So we have these sort of two brewing solidarity blocks. But down, I think in terms of debtor organizing, I think it would it depends if you're organizing by creditor. There could be campaigns targeting Wells Fargo or Chase, JP Morgan Chase, or you could have you could also organize people regionally. So I think there's different vectors, different ways of approaching organizing. So like I said, we're drilling into organizing at the regional level, because Philadelphia is a place where we have more organizing capacity, and to see what, to sort of push the envelope on what a municipality can do.
So I've got another good one from Omkar. The question is, can you please address the word disobedience a little more? What is the leverage of individual disobedience in a global authoritarian movement towards virtual communities and surveillance to limit individual freedom and expression?
Okay.
So basically, what is it? What is disobedience?
Oh, yeah,
what do we mean by that?
Yeah.
And what kind of leverage can disobedience have?
What's interesting, because one thing, I'm just reading it. So what is the leverage of individual disobedience? And I would say little, because it has to be collective disobedience. If it's individual disobedience, if you're on a one woman debt strike like I was, then you're just defaulting, and you're damaging your credit score. I mean, and it's quite interesting because because of who I am, people tell me their personal stories all the time. I mean, I've heard amazing stories from individual debt resistors who have devised astonishing ways of getting around their debts and living either off the grid or sort of finding these loopholes or machinations they're able to use to survive. And so there's something interesting about those people. I mean, I sort of cheer them on, but I'm someone who ultimately believes that we have to take collective action. So I think the thing is there is power in numbers, right? And that collectivity is inherent in the concept for me. I mean, the idea of economic disobedience echoes civil disobedience. This idea of putting your body on the line, of taking a direct action that exerts a kind of force. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about it in terms of coercion, that ultimately, power means you want to coerce your adversary into changing their behavior. It's not, I mean, this was also, I think, something for us as the debt collective coming out of Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street refused to have demands. And I think we can debate that forever. I think Occupy was what it was in the moment and given, the state of the left at that time. But I think, we believe that you build power so that you have the capacity to make demands. And we are living in dangerous times. But at the same time, with a very small number of people, we've been able to move the needle, at least on this issue. In terms of winning relief, we also won quite a significant change to federal law. So in the U.S., you can't use bankruptcy to get out of your student loans, because Joe Biden in 2005 helped his main constituency, sort of the financial services of Delaware, sort of rewrite the bankruptcy rules. So private student loans, at least, are now ineligible for bankruptcy. And so we helped, basically our campaign clarified a right that all student borrowers have to get their debts discharged if they've been lied to, right? So it's the first inroad into actually being able to legally have your debts discharged. And that's so we were able to win that under Obama, and then even under the Trump administration, we've held the line. And if I could flash an image on the screen, if I was organized, what I would do is show you the signature from Betsy DeVos, who has been forced to continue to issue debt relief. So just in January, one of our strikers got her $220,000 of student loans canceled. And so the thing Betsy DeVos has been saying is she is forced to continue to issue debt relief is with extreme displeasure, in her sort of upbeat, bubbly, cursive handwriting. So, I mean, I think things are dire. I mean, things are, pretty bleak, and we lack power, but the only path forward is to build that power and to just sort of keep testing the waters and see what we can experiment if we act collectively, not individually.
I'd like to jump in and just say, yes, we do lack power, but in a sense, at this moment, I think we have gained a sort of invisible momentum, because everything that we've been saying about debt for years, right, is just a stark reality slapping everyone in the face right now. And without even our analysis being on the minds of some people, they're saying exactly the same things that we've been saying. So in that sense, there is an electrified moment, right, that just needs to be capitalized off of without, jumping in.
No, I like what you're saying. I mean, we have to remember how we were mocked. I mean, we as a group often go back to these early press hits from 2012. So some of the co-founders of the Debt Collective organized this thing called 1T Day, which was a protest the day student loan debt surpassed $1 trillion. It's now
right.
And the media response was they thought we were risible. I mean, they literally said, they quoted an expert who laughed and guffawed at us and just said, student debt will never be canceled. And, a few months ago in the pre-COVID world that now seems so distant, but not that long ago, I was just reading the New Yorker and it said, well, obviously student debt is going to be canceled. The question is just how much. And you can say that because we, again, have the receipts on a growing number of people who have received substantial debt relief, like Pam, who I just mentioned, who has her $220,000 erased. So I think what we've shown, is that it can be done. But I think in this moment, like you're saying, people there has been a shift of consciousness that has been building, and the challenge now is to shift that, to go from a shift in consciousness to constructive, coordinated action.
And this kind of segues in. It's just about psyche, and maybe we can segue somebody into a more a mode of thinking and being that feels more empowering. But Lucia says, could you tell me more about your thoughts on debt as a form of state control over the individual psyche? And for you, would economic disobedience on individual level manifest the agency of a consumer indebted? But basically, I think the important part is this a control over an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point about optimism or your sort of, I mean, I think the central point of our analysis is that we have power, we're just not using it, right? Is that the form of oppression, the debt that you feel is this weight on your back and that keeps you up all night and that stresses you out, can actually be can be totally shifted into a source of power if you join with others, right? So that is our happy story, and that we've seen this story manifested. A lot of us, I would think, who are on this call, know the psychic consequences of debt. I think there's lots of studies that show that people, have anxiety disorders, that there's also people have heart problems. That debt actually takes a physical toll on people's mental and physical health. So it's certainly part of this set of conditions that I think is actually, for the first time in the last century, like reducing the lifespan of working Americans. This is part of the constellation of problems that's reducing the quality of life for people who don't have affluence. So I think that's also why, the Debt Collective has done a lot of work around the psychic component of debt, even if we haven't really called it that. And that is, again, I think I spoke more about shame, which is like one of the sort of psychological profiles of indebtedness. The shame, the idea that you made a mistake, you shouldn't have signed that loan when you were 17 and going to college, you should have known better. Or if you were just a better parent, you wouldn't need to, put your groceries on a credit card. And so that shame can really weight people down. But what we found is that when people are able to voice it in a public forum, it's just transformative. So we host these things called Debtors Assemblies. I wrote about one in a New Yorker piece I did recently called The Right to Listen. That was about the politics of listening. Reading it would seem like another world right now, but sort of like, why are we obsessed with free speech? We should also be we should also be attentive to not just speech, but listening. And part of being in these assemblies, these debtors assemblies, it's very powerful, I think, for a person to stand up and sort of confess and say, this is my story. But it's even more transformative to hear your situation echoed in the experience of everybody in the room. So our slogan at the Debt Collective is, you are not alone, but spelled A_LOAN, right? And this thing of that actually, this condition you take so personally and that psychically weighs on you is a political and collective condition. And so I think the first step often for people in terms of changing their psychic relationship to debt is to have this kind of assembly type experience where they recognize that other people are in the same boat. And then the idea is, to go from shame to indignation and to recognizing power and to building power. And so that's the sort of, and I think that happens through a process of political education, but also just proving to people that this tactic can get actual results.
I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I'm going to investigate that in a second. But this is an interesting question by Joseph Del Pesco. And I feel like it's an opening for us to discuss how debt operates and how people on face value just intuitively think debt should work. Yeah. So he says, do student debt payments go to fund future student loans? Which is kind of like, when you take, I feel like when you take your average person off the street and you say, how do banks work? It's like, oh, they just hold your money and they put it in the vault and
yeah. I think
it doesn't operate.
It doesn't. And the government doesn't need your student loan payments. And it's also one of these things that's interesting to dig into the question of administration and bureaucracy too. The question, there's whole debates around means testing and this issue too is, if you have a program and you're going to means test it and give some service to some people, but not others. And that implies like, okay, it's not universal. So therefore some people have to apply and do all this paperwork and get sorted out. It increases the administrative costs, the administrative burden on the state. And so, no, the government doesn't need your student loans. The thing is, it points, the question of student debt abolition points to a bigger problem of how we do finance higher education, which is something I've flitted by. But there has been, state investment. There's been austerity at the state level. Money has been pulled away from the big public universities and also community colleges, and they have made up the difference and then some. They've made up the difference and also, sort of bloating administrative budgets, and if they're a sort of larger school, investments in things that will attract out-of-state students, because out-of-state students pay more. So there's an underlying problem about how are we funding our university system, but that's not money that's coming strictly from the Department of Education. And then I think there's a real kind of cost-saving and dignity-saving argument to be made for just universal access and saving people from broken bureaucracy as both a kind of moral principle and also just as an economically rational one. One philosophical framework I want to get across too for the debt collective, I just think is one part of our thinking that's crucial, is that we're not against all debts, right? We have, I think for us, the big problem is that we're paying the wrong debts as a society, because we are stuck paying our credit card bills and our student loans, and we're paying these debts that are ultimately, enriching the portfolios of the 1%. We're defaulting on our true debts to one another, right? We're not providing the social services that we deserve or the public goods that we need to have a dignified life. We're not paying reparations. That's a debt that needs to be paid. As the United States, we're not paying our climate debt. We have overused our share of the climate budget. Economic budgets are flexible. Ecological budgets in terms of carbon are less so. And we owe a debt to the rest of the world because we've done a lot of the damage. So I think the part of what we want is a sort of moral accounting. We want a society where we can pay the debts that matter. And to do that, I think we have to default on some of these other debts, these exploitative debts.
I'm going to pick, I think, two more. I think that we have enough time for that. This is a real good one from Farah. Could you recommend sources, pros and cons for rent strikes in this moment? Or in another way, how can people find out more information about rent strikes?
Jacques, what are all these documents that have been going around the debt collective channels? Do you have anything? I feel like there have been so many, but
yeah, definitely. I mean, there's I have something, so I can type it into the directly to you, Farah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you asked that, because I would check back at the debt collective's website in the next few weeks, because we are working on, it's not guaranteed that it will happen, but working on a kind of strike hub that will connect these sort of organic, spontaneous strikes, rent strikes, debt strikes, with hopefully some resource support, possibly even funding, and also media support, so that we can also get the word out. And so that a kind of strike hub. So in addition to these sort of Google Docs that are floating around with a sort of a list, we also did another list that was various household debt related actions around the world too, that we can share if we can find it. But yeah, and we might be building out our platform for this other component. Exactly.
We want to highlight the strikes that are happening around the US and have it in a place where it's easy to find and just has all the information in one spot. And again, if you just answered that, that's because I'm a little scattered. I'm like answering questions over here, reading this over there. And okay. One thing I want to say to all the attendees is please make sure if your question is not answered, well, two things. If your question is not answered, please go to debtcollective.org, find our email address, send us your questions, and just say hello. Hey, what's going on? How can we work together? That would be super, super, super helpful. If you have or have not had your answers, your questions answered. So that's a way that we can dispute your debt while you're there. Exactly. And some people are asking, how has this moment changed our organizing? And I feel like I can answer that. Go for it. Yeah, we're basically building, right? Okay, if you can't go outside under the threat of some kind of governmental decree, then we're building up, you know, our infrastructure, we're retooling how we're operating, we're thinking about what we can do next. You see what I mean? So we're getting, you know, we're the guys sitting working out, waiting for the summer to come so that you can go out and show off what you've got, right? We're in the middle of that moment.
Yeah. I think there is, though, I think there's actually quite a lot we can do in this moment. Like, you know, because I think one thing I feel is that the way our economy functions, to go back to this idea of like, what is neoliberalism? What is financialization? Part of its core sort of characteristic was this distancing, right? Supply chains were distanced. So, you know, Nike is a brand, but actually the shoes are manufactured, you know, in Indonesia or Taiwan or, you know, Mexico,
Exactly.
or, you know, gig workers, right? If you're a gig worker, you never interface with your actual, you know, or sometimes you do, but you may not interface with your actual employer. Maybe you're just interfacing through an app, or you know, there's the sort of fissured workplace people talk about where it's, you know, even a public university will subcontract out its janitorial services or whatever it is. So, you know, distance was already infused into the economic model to disempower workers.
Exactly.
Accelerate, the accumulation of profits. So in that sense, I'm like, now that distancing is just, it's almost like now it's, because we're literally stuck in our houses, we have to figure out how to overcome this distance that was already part of the dilemma we were facing. So, I mean, you can join a campaign of debt resistance and it doesn't necessarily involve a traditional protest. Now, I think it makes it more challenging. It makes it more challenging to connect. And, you know, it's always nice to be in real space with people, but I think it's actually it's a promising approach in this moment. And I think there are these moments. So we've seen how the rules can change. Jacques spoke to this very eloquently. You know, we've seen the money's there. It turns out they can leverage $2.2 trillion overnight. It could have gone to a Green New Deal. We've also seen they can put money in your bank account, as Jacques said. We've seen that actually evictions can be paused. We've seen homeless people can be given shelter. And so things are happening, you know, concrete things are happening in our communities, like, you know, courts have closed, right? And that means that debts aren't being, judgments aren't being, judgments are halted, so people's bank accounts aren't being seized. And so these are things where we can say, okay, you're closed for this month, let's prolong that, right? Let's put pressure on the court system to continue that so that we can actually build the momentum we need to come out of this period of social distancing with the force that we need. I mean, Naomi Klein said the other day, so that we can come out of this running and not walking. But I think that means, you know, organizing is always this mix of like, you have the broad theoretical apparatus and your big moral principles, and then you have to find the place you can hook them. Can you hook it into the Department of Education? Can you hook it into this one bank? Can you hook it into the municipality you live in the court system and make a demand? And I think there's lots of opportunities for organizing. You know, can you engage? Can you build energy around a rent strike and then build a tenants union and then, you know, fight for larger structural reforms like rent control or, you know, more dignified social housing. So I think there's lots of possibility in this moment. And the one thing I will say is that organizing is also therapeutic. I mean, I can't imagine going through what we're all going through without the Debt Collective and getting to be with my friend Jacques every day and the rest of the eccentric people involved in this project, because it really is. I mean, obviously it's been a major part of my life. I've been involved now for going on a decade, but I think right now it feels like a real lifeline and a source of hope.
Definitely. So we have, I've been told we have time for two more.
Oh.
Let's see. So this one, I think you'll like this because of your other work on data and the internet. So anonymous attendee, go figure. Yes. Is there a strategic reason why Astra, oh, I'm sorry, wait, that is not the right one. Hold on. Sorry. Ariel, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I was curious if you have any thought about how we can collectivize, politicize, or leverage our data.
Oh, we love this question.
Yeah. it's a very exploitative and extractive relationship, blah, blah, blah. Yes.
Yeah. I think the data question is really fascinating. So the Debt Collective has co-written a pamphlet that's coming out with Haymarket, and one of the chapters is about tech. Tech is definitely something I've been thinking about. I wrote a book called The People's Platform that essentially, it's like, what's wrong with the internet? Well, the political economy of it's wrong. I mean, the fact that the internet as we know it is funded by advertising and data collection, and essentially, what Shoshana Zuboff now calls surveillance capitalism is, deeply troubling. And I think we're seeing that in many ways in this moment, from the fact that we're relying on platforms like Zoom to connect in this essential way, to the fact that, we're all reading the news obsessively, not we all, but I am. I'm reading the news obsessively all day and clicking away. And yet journalism is in crisis because the advertising revenue is down, because people aren't buying and selling according to their normal patterns, right? So this is just one example of how the commercial model of the internet is just completely like irrational. And to me, we really have to hold these two things and we have to be clear that, I think that's why the phrase surveillance capitalism is so important, is that this is not just the state or Big Brother spying on us, but it's actually the sort of business model of the services we use. So one thing that really motivated me after thinking about this and sort of doing the writer thing is like, let me tell you all the ways this is bad. But the organizer is like, okay, well, where is there some way we can hack the system, or what can we do? And the thing is, data is fascinating. I want data for the people. So one thing about, when we think about finance, is that creditors have the ability to see us. Again, we're in the red, but in the dark, but they see us. We're in the dark to ourselves. We can't see each other, but they see us. They rank us and score us. We get credit scores, but we also get, not just credit scores in the traditional way that are regulated, but also these consumer scores that track us around the internet. And so part of our platform is based on this sort of thought experiment, which is, well, what would it be like to be able to aggregate information about debt and debtors, and to be able to use that to build strategies. So we do collect data, we do our best to respect people's privacy and all of that. But the idea is that out of our data will come, if we can kind of sort the signal from the noise, that we'll be able to get strategic insights in it. We'll be able to see patterns of abuse. The thing is that nobody really knows how our financial system works, because it's so decentralized and there's so much law breaking going around, right? So it's like, I almost see us sometimes as what we're doing is like injecting ink in the veins, like from below, to sort of trace up, like we collect people join the platform, they tell us about their debts. And it's these data points that allow us to sort of build an accurate map of exploitation from the bottom up. So I think that's just one, example of trying to use data for the public good. I think we are running up against a sort of political economy problem too, which is like, it doesn't pay. We're not selling the data on the side and offering people less predatory loans. So, we have a resourcing problem, right? This is not the kind of work that is not just not profitable, but self-sustaining really in our current reality. I also want to just point to Ben Tarnoff, who's an editor at Logic, and he's also a techie by day, editor by night, and thinker, who has some really useful frameworks for thinking about data. And he says, yes, a lot of data and internet infrastructure needs to be democratized or socialized, turned into public utilities, but we also need to think about abolition. A lot of data should not be collected, and that's it. There's lots of data that just doesn't need, it's like oil, leave it in the ground, leave the data on the earth, don't put it in the cloud. And I think we have to have a sort of abolitionist framework going into these conversations that just like, no, just because you can digitize it, just because you can collect it and analyze it doesn't mean that you need to.
Totally on board with that, definitely. And okay. With that, I think we are going to close up. Do you have any final overarching mega thoughts or comments that you want to get out to everybody before we leave?
No, I mean, it's just the same old point, which is we have to get organized. That's it. We have brilliant ideas, we have imagination, but what we need to build power, and you do that collectively. How about you? Got a good last thought, my friend?
Yeah, we've been busy trying very hard to build a platform where debtors can go online and speak to each other and figure out, what they can do together, whether it be mutual aid or like your support or anything, basically the sky's the limit. And the thing is, now we're on this kind of virtual lockdown, right? In many cases. So it's the perfect time to come on over to the platform that we've built, discuss with us, see, volunteer. You got some time? There's nothing but time now. Come on now. So come and see us at debtcollective.org or volunteer.debtcollective.org or strike at strike.debtcollective.org. Just drop us a line, an email. We need to build power, like you said. How do we build power? By speaking to one another and conspiring together to make a better world.
Cool. Well said. Thank you, friend.
Thank you. And thanks to all the attendees. Have a fantastic night.